Access to land is intricately linked to human rights. According to the Constitution, everyone has a right to access to land. Good evening, I'm Aldrin Simpier, and this is Unfiltered. In South Africa, the issue of land rights is an emotive and controversial debate for many, especially those who suffered dispossession during apartheid. Disputes over land are also often cause of human rights violations, conflicts, as well as violence. As we mark Human Rights Day, we ask you, do ordinary South Africans have access to land in a democratic South Africa? Our guest this evening is Human Rights Commissioner JB Sibanyoni, who will be joining us a bit later on. We also have the Head of Policy and Action at AfriForum, Aaron Sruitz, as well as John van Rooyen, who is a councillor with the National Khoi and San Council and Supreme Leader of the Kung people of South Africa. Remember that you can be part of the conversations as well on social media by using the hashtag Unfiltered. What do you make of the claim that South Africans have to the land, which the Constitution says South Africa belongs to all who live in it? But before that, let's quickly listen to what President Cyril Ramaphosa had to say yesterday as the country marked Human Rights Day.
We must be a society where the land is owned not by a few, but where all access is given to our people for land, development, and progress, and for self-upliftment. Above all, we must be a society that recognizes the dignity of every individual and the role of every man, woman, and child in building a better future. This is the promise of our Constitution.
Okay, and let's get into that conversation. Let's start off with John van Rooyen. John, good evening. Welcome to the show. How would you characterize South Africans' claim to the land?
Good evening, Sabia, and good evening to your viewers. Everyone has a right to land or access to land. In particular, where we come from, is the San and Khoi peoples. People call it the Khoisan now, but it's San and Khoi. First San and then Khoi. And San refers to the Bushmen. Now, the land of South Africa belongs to the San and the Khoi peoples. But notwithstanding other people that are here, from European descent, settlers that came here, colonialists that came here, and also invaders that came here from Central Africa. Yes, but the land, we are free. We are saying that to some extent, some of the land can also be given to them. But to cut it all short and to be short and simple, the land belongs to the San people. Let's say the San. Let's not even bring in the Khoi, because the Khoi comes with something else. But the San people, the Bushman people. Yeah.
Okay. When you speak about the San people, who are those?
The San people is what people refer interchangeably use San and Bushman. And those are the first inhabitants, original inhabitants in South Africa, and also DNA is proof now in the world. So at the moment in South Africa, you have the Khoi, you have the Kung, and you've got the Komani San. And those are the three, and also the Kam. So those are the four San and Bushman groups that are recognized in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that those who would have come from, if we accept what historians are arguing in that there are people who are in the country who come from an African descent, from Central Africa to be particular, would you also say that they have a claim to the land?
If one is to be brutally honest, no. Because they are not the first inhabitants of South Africa. But in terms of what happened later and how things evolved, as the San and Khoi people, we are saying that we need to have discussions around the land issue. And so the same way as those brothers of ours who came from Central Africa need to have access to land. The same way with also the Afrikaners and also white people. We need to have a discussion around that. and say, yes, we can't take all the land at this point in time. We cannot, there's no way that we will get all the land, but let us have a discussion around it and acknowledge the fact that the San is basically the indigenous or the first people of South Africa. And then we can have a discussion around the other groupings and how they fit into that whole process.
Okay, Aaron's joining us for this conversation as well. Do you agree with that characterization around who the land belongs to and who has claim to the land? Sorry, Aaron, if you can just quickly unmute yourself there.
Apologies. Thank you, Aldrin. I would certainly agree that the Khoi and the San have a very contentious history in South Africa, and that they do have a right to be recognized as or to get First Nation status. I think it's a historical fact that they were here first. So in a sense, I think the claim is accurate. What makes it more complicated, however, is that that land can be transferred through certain, there are legitimate ways, and then of course, as we know, there are illegitimate ways of transferring land. So if you were the first inhabitant of a piece of land, and for example, hypothetically speaking, you sold that land to someone, then you cannot claim that because you were there first, therefore the land has to be given back to you. But I think that's equally, or not equally, it's probably more important when we talk about the land reform debate in general.
Sure.
That one of the important question that isn't considered is, how was the land acquired? It's one thing to say, oh, you are white, you shouldn't own the land, but you should at least ask the question, how did that person acquire the land?
Where does conquest form or enter this conversation?
Well, I think we can all agree now that conquest is not a legitimate form of obtaining land, but it's a bit more complicated than that also, because we know that in the past, conquest was by many African tribes at least, or groupings, considered as a legitimate form of obtaining land. And we know that by the wars of Msilikatse and the wars of King Shaka and so forth. So that was regarded as a legitimate form back then, but I think we can now all agree that it isn't. The question is, does that count? Does that go in reverse? Do we now say that the initial ways in which this land was acquired by, for example, the Zulus is not legitimate because they use conquest, therefore it isn't their land? It's very difficult to have a debate like this, especially when we're talking, we can have the debate, but when we're trying to convert this into some form of government policy, it becomes very, very tricky.
Okay, and John, do you agree with that? John, just unmute yourself as well.
Yes. I'm so happy that Ernst is mentioning it and acknowledging the fact that the land really belongs to the San, or there's a legitimate claim in terms of that. In terms of how it was acquired, and if land was sold, we know the land wasn't sold, you know. People will come back and say, yes, land was sold. We're talking now in 1652. Let's just take 1652 in the Van Riebeeck era. Land was not sold to Van Riebeeck, you know, or what you deem selling of the sale of land. Is it a bottle of whiskey, and you pay for the whole South Africa, or the whole of Southern Africa with a bottle of whiskey? And so we need to look at that, and we need to determine what was it. If there was nothing. I mean, if you look at it, it's conquest basically. It is the topic for tonight. You started out with expropriation, or you indicated with expropriation without compensation, for argument's sake. But if you look at Van Riebeeck expropriated our land, my forefathers, my ancestors' land. He expropriated it without compensation. And so if there's an issue around they paid for the land, we need to look at that. How much did they pay for it? When did they pay for it? What was the amount? How did they pay for it? Was it legitimate, you know, or what, the languages? They didn't even speak the same language. They didn't understand each other, you know.
Okay.
So one needs to then investigate that part of it. But I'm happy that there is a bit of acknowledgement in terms of the land belonging to the San people or the Bushman people.
Okay, and when we come back, we're going to have a conversation about how government is trying to address some of those questions that have been raised by my guests. Remember that you can be part of the conversation going onto social media using the hashtag Unfiltered. Any question that you'd like to put to my guest, and also any comment that you have in conjunction to this conversation that we're having this evening. And welcome back to Unfiltered with me, Aldrin Simpiers. We have a conversation around the land question as the country marked Human Rights Day yesterday. And now we're also joined by Commissioner J.B. Sibanyoni, who is part of the Human Rights Commission. Babu Sibanyoni, good afternoon, good evening rather. Welcome to the show. A part of the conversation that you missed a bit earlier on was when we asked the question about who does the land belong to, and John and Ernst went back into what the anthropologists are telling us about who the land belongs to. But in contemporary South Africa, who does the land belong to?
Well, I will base my argument on the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter, which was adopted on the 26th of June 1955. One of the clauses says, the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. Therefore, the land belongs to those who need to work it. But if we look at the history of South Africa, you will realize that there were wars of resistance. The wars of resistance was the war between those people who settled in South Africa and then with those that they found in South Africa. And then we should not forget about the Khoi and the San people, who were the first people who encountered the people who settled in this tip of the continent, South Africa.
Okay.
And then when they went deep into the land, they found the Xhosas, they found the Zulus, they found the Debeles, they found the Pedis, the whole host of the people who were around here.
The answer that you gave now in reference to the Freedom Charter of 1955, in that the land belongs to those who work the land, isn't it rooted in idealism? Like, ideally, that is what it should be. However, though, that's not what's happening.
Yes, ideology, it is that the land needs to be worked, because I think with the advent of time, people have lost the value of the land. The land needs to be worked so that a person should plow, plant and harvest, or graze his or her livestock. But nowadays, you find people, when they see a piece of land, they only view it as a place to build a house. And some of them, they will also build a shack. I think those who are viewing it in that way are missing a point, because the land is a resource that needs to be utilized. That should be taught.
Yeah. Okay, John, the land is a resource that should be utilized. Do you think that in what has happened with commercialization of the land as well, it has led to this land hunger, the question of the land hunger that we deal with? That in one aspect you have those who speak about land hunger, would like to do business on the land, but on the other end you also have those who speak about land hunger in that they're speaking about being landless.
Yes, absolutely. You know, as the president yesterday has said, among others, during his National Human Rights Day speech, he said, it is not correct that only a few are owning the land.
Sure.
And then the majority of the people should have land. Oh. And then to eradicate that land hunger, I should think more and more people should be having access to land, and then to utilize it to the fullest, so that the hunger should be eradicated.
John, your take on that?
Yeah, you look, I think, Commissioner, you cannot go back to a Freedom Charter that was adopted hundreds or even thousands of years after you have people that's been on a piece of property, on a piece of land, and you find them there and you come with one piece of paper, one document, and now you use that and you say, this is now policy, this is the it all and be all. The argument that you put forward is, I mean, if I go and work in Nigeria, do I now have the right to own the land in Nigeria, sort of a thing? So that comes with a whole lot of other things. But I think, Eldrin, in terms of what you are saying with regard to commercializing it, that yes, we need to. You have the two parts of land. The one is where you have to feed either yourself, your community, your country, and assist the poorest of the poor, the landless, to be part of that process. But you also need to commercialize, because why? If you're sitting on a piece of land and you're not fully utilizing it for export purposes, so for local consumption, to feed the people, feed the needy, feed the hungry, and if one could probably take what the commissioner was talking about, the Freedom Charter, then I think it ties in with that part of it, you know, where the poor should be fed, the poor should be form part of tilling the land, etc. But one also needs to look at commercializing it, because you need to generate income so that you can sustain people. So there's an issue of sustainable or sustainability.
John, what then happens if the rightful owner of the land doesn't have the commercial muscle to ensure that that land actually does generate wealth? How do we deal with that aspect?
Yes. You need to open up your mind, and you need to then get into partnerships. You need to look at a moment now where we are sitting, where we talk about the land, only 15%. The last time when I looked at it, 15% sits in the hands of the state. The rest is privately owned and also foreign owned. So what then happens is that you need to, for the purposes of tilling the land and turning the land into, to ensure that people have access to land, people have access to the benefits of the land, one needs to enter into partnerships. One need to enter, so whether it's a private sector, whether it's in the agricultural sector, whether it's Forum or Agri-Forum, one needs to begin to do that. Partnerships, yes. We need to work together, and we need partnerships. Otherwise, we are not going to get through this.
Aaron, just quickly on this question around cooperatives and working together, that what we found as well, where there has been a successful claim to a piece of land, is that even the claimants themselves then decide to resell the land.
Yes, Aldrin, we see that. We've seen that happened a lot. Where, and I actually once had a discussion. Was at a discussion where a representative of the Department of Land Reform spoke about this issue, and what the representative said was actually very alarming, because he, according to government, it seems that they simply look at this through a racial lens. In other words, the ANC position appears to be, if you are white and you own land, then you are an illegitimate owner of that land. And if you are black, then it is legitimate, regardless of how you obtained that land. And what this representative of government said is that there's this problem of transferring or distributing land from white ownership to black ownership. In other words, to correct historic injustices. And then in some cases, we find that the new owner, who is black, then sells the land. And it could happen that the buyer is a white person. And then this representative of the department said, in their view, that means the injustice, the correction of the injustice has been reversed. Which in our view is just simply a racist position to take. It means that if you're white and you buy a piece of land from someone, then that is an injustice, and that land has to be taken from you without compensation. Okay. I mean, we do have a very serious history of land ownership and a very contentious history, and it's something that we should deal with. But to deal with this simply by saying, if you are white and you own land, then it's illegitimate, and if you are black and you own land, then it's legitimate. That's just, firstly, it's simply racist. But secondly, it's not going to lead to any form of a sustainable policy.
Okay, so when we come back, we're going to look at the attempts, at least, to amend Section 25 of the Constitution around land expropriation without compensation. The Human Rights Commission says that they actually support that, so we're going to get some answers from them why exactly it is that they support them. But also, there's the expropriation bill that some people have some issues with. Remember, you can be part of the conversation on social media, #Unfiltered. And welcome back to Unfiltered. Just before we say goodbye to our SABC3 viewers, let's just quickly hear from Ernst Roots what your take is, Ernst, when it comes to the question around land expropriation without compensation, to deal with the question around land restitution and also land redistribution.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad that you differentiated between restitution and redistribution because, as you obviously know, the two aren't the same. Unfortunately, a lot of people do think it's the same thing. And we are opposed to this bill precisely for that reason. We are in favor of land restitution, and that means that there where land was taken from someone illegitimately, it must be given back, but it must be done on a factual basis, as opposed to redistribution that simply says, look at the color of your skin, and that would determine if it's appropriate or legitimate or not. The problem with this bill is it will be destructive. It will give too much power to government. There are some ambiguities in the bill. It includes all property, not only land. So this bill would also give government the power to expropriate movable property, to expropriate intellectual property. And if you read the bill and you really consider what the impact or the consequences thereof would be, it doesn't have anything to do anymore with correcting historic injustices. It's in as far as they say it's about correcting the wrongs of the past, it's basically a propaganda ploy. What this bill is about is giving as much power as possible to the government to regulate land ownership, regardless of whether historically that ownership was legitimate or not.
Okay, let's just quickly say goodbye to our SABC3 viewers. The conversation, though, continues on the SABC News channel on the DSTV bouquet, that is channel 404. Thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered this evening with me, Aldrin St. Pierre. And welcome back to Unfiltered as we continue to have a conversation around the land question as the country marked Human Rights Day yesterday. Ernst, let me just quickly come back to you now. So when we speak about the issue around land redistribution and also land expropriation, are you saying that the only marker for land expropriation must be that the land was acquired illegally?
Yes, well, the point is that we have to differentiate between restitution and redistribution. The whole point about restitution is to correct something that went wrong, some injustice. The point of redistribution, at least in this context, is to say what is the skin color or the race of the person who owns the land, and that would be the determining factor, which is obviously, if to use that term, illegitimate. It's an injustice to try to use race as a proxy for determining whether this is appropriate or not. So if we're talking about a community that was deprived of their land, then they should be able to get the land back, because these things were documented, and we support that. And that's the difference between restitution and redistribution.
Does the question of, Ernst, I'm still asking you this question, does the question around generational wealth that has been created through land that was acquired illegally also then become part of the conversation? Because here I'm asking about the size of a land. Like, let's say somebody has 10,000 hectares of a piece of land. Then that brings about a conversation about, is there a question around putting a cap onto the size of land that any single individual can own?
Well, I mean, we can and we should have discussions like these, but when we talk about government policies, these policies must also be realistic and they must be practicable. So if we go into abstract reasoning and calculations about things where you have to make a bunch of assumptions, it becomes very difficult to make a practical government policy. So it's fine if we have this discussion, but again, the underlying notion here still is somehow that if you are white or if you are not black or if you have a particular racial group, then somehow that makes it illegitimate. I think there are more important, there are easier ways of dealing with this, and we can look at things or talk about wealth that was acquired as a result of this, but how do you transfer that into a policy?
Okay, Bab Sibanyon, I don't know, has the Human Rights Commission ever looked at that particular question around the size of land that any single individual, for instance, can own? I know that the panel that was set up by the president that looked into the land question also raises this particular question.
The Human Rights Commission has not specifically looked at that issue of capping the land. But as the Human Rights Commission, we have got a mandate to transform the society, to secure the rights, to restore dignity. And if there is a section of the people of South Africa that do not have the right to land, those rights need to be secured. And if a person doesn't have land, a person who, or the community that has land previously, their dignity needs to be restored. And as I'm sitting here, I will say the injustices of the past were brought about by passing legislation. Presently, there are current legislation like the Constitution, which the preamble clearly states that we therefore adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Those injustices that were done in the past is the land dispossession, which needs to be corrected.
Okay. Would you agree, though, Babu Sibanyoni, to an idea of capping the size of land that any single individual can own? That when we deal with the question of inequality, that's also a question that should come into the conversation?
Personally, I will say yes, I will agree, because, Adrian, when you fly in the air there and you look down, you ask yourself, who owns that land? Where when you drive and you see tracts and tracts of land, and you ask yourself, who owns those tracts and tracts of land? And then you look at another section of the community, you find that those people are still staying in those matchbox houses. And those people are staying in places like Alexandra. And then the people are still staying in shacks. And then there is a gap, an inequality gap. Therefore, to balance, I will say, really, it will be making a sense to say a person cannot, an individual, own a land in Free State, another land in Mpumalanga province, another land in the Western Cape, and another piece of land in the Northern Cape, and then speculate on some of those land that are lying fallow. Keep an ostrich, 2 ostriches that are roaming huge tracts of land. It's really a cause for concern.
Okay, John, do you think it is a cause for concern?
People owning land? Vast pieces of land?
Vast pieces of land, yeah.
I think your question to Ernst and to Commissioner Sibanyoni was whether there should be a cap in terms of the size of the land that people should own. I think yes, there should be, because if you've got somebody that sits with, for argument's sake, 1,000 hectares of land, and they've only used 200 hectares in the last 30, 40 years, the possibility of them using 480 hectares in the next, or 780 hectares in the next, how long will it take them? So I think in terms of that, one could probably say, let's cap it and say the person can 500 hectares and the other 500 hectares, you then open it up for either the workers on the farm or that work on that property, or in the community that surrounds that property. That kind of setup and thing. But yes, in terms of, I think one should probably look at that. It's worth looking at that, yeah.
Well, and that's a conversation that the government of the day is not having, as Ernst Roots there also pointed out, that nothing in the policy speaks to that particular question around capping the size of land, because the land is linked to wealth and generational wealth that is created out of land as well. So when we come back, there are those people that are owning these vast tracts of land. On the other end, you have land hunger, especially in urban areas. And what we've seen often on TV is evictions, evictions, evictions. That conversation just after this. And welcome back to Unfiltered. The next segment of this conversation is around evictions, which you've seen on our TV screens. And the Human Rights Commission has been dealing with a lot of these complaints. And Tate Sibanyoni, your take on how the country is approaching this issue around evictions. Former President Thabo Mbeki argues that as we have the conversation around land expropriation, we are not having a conversation around the land hunger, especially in urban areas.
Yes, maybe quickly let me weigh in on the evictions. Some of those evictions are not straightforward evictions, but they are constructive evictions in the sense that life is made so unbearable on the farms to such an extent that the person decides to leave the farm and go and settle in an informal settlement. And then that is indirect eviction. And then also that a person who has got some livestock, either the dam is fenced off, the person's livestock does not have access to land, or a person who has been drawing water from the stream, a stream is diverted to a pond, and then after it is diverted, a borehole is installed, and the person who's owning the farm is saying people should pay, should buy water for their own consumption as the farm occupiers, as well as to let the livestock, head of cattle, to drink water that is being purchased and the like. And then coming to the second part of your question, Adrian, I think the question of land hunger really needs to be addressed. And then as the South African Human Rights Commission, we always extend a hand to say we want to engage, we want to have a conversation with all stakeholders so as to ensure that the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution are realized.
Okay. Ernst, how do we deal with that issue around evictions?
Well, I think we should talk about evictions and how do we deal with it, because it's not that simple, because we can say we need to solve the issue of evictions, but it's also an issue of the right to private property and the right to be able to deal with your property in the way in which you see fit. So if you legitimately own a piece of land, you do have the right to be able to decide who do you give permission to live on that land and who doesn't have permission. That's part of what comes with private property. Now we can say that's atrocious and that type of thing must be abolished, but that only means that we abolish the right to private property. But there's a big dark cloud that hangs over this entire discussion that we're not seeming to have, and that's that we keep talking about these policies and what are all the problems that we need to solve, but we're not discussing the fact that the attempts that have been made thus far to solve these problems have made things worse. The fact that the South African government themselves have acknowledged that more than 90% of land reform projects have failed. But now it's as if they acknowledge this, but then they just say, well, we need to keep bashing on with the same policy.
Yeah, like so the willing buyer, willing seller policy, for instance.
No, well the willing buyer, willing seller policy.
They said that one didn't work for them.
No, that's like saying that we have a mellow policy. We have a mellow socialist policy that is failing. Now we need a more aggressive socialist policy that is, as if that's not going to fail more aggressively. So if you have a policy that's failing halfway, you can implement it more aggressively, and that doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a solution. It's going to lead to a more aggressive failure. So if we take away willing buyer, willing seller, that means we're taking also away the right to own or the right to deal with private property.
Yeah.
And that has been tried many times.
But which we agree that the willing seller, willing buyer policy has not given government what its targets were in terms of land redistribution.
I don't think the willing buyer, willing seller policy is the reason why government has not achieved its targets. I can tell you why I'm saying this, because government has spent, it's by now, probably up to 60 billion rands on land reform, including buying property and so forth. But of all the property they've acquired since 1994, only 6% have been transferred into private ownership. So government's just increasing the property that they own. They're not transferring it to the people, and now they're blaming the willing buyer, willing seller policy.
Okay, John, quickly, just your take on evictions.
Yeah, I think evictions is not good, and it shouldn't happen. But there are. I mean, if someone comes and illegally invade a person's property, then I think that person has a right to go to court or go to the authorities and request for that person to be evicted. If one takes Eldrin, your own property, whether you're renting it or whether you're owning it, let's assume it's 1 acre or it's 1,000 square meters, and you've got a yard there of 100 square meters that's just idle, and someone comes and decides to put up 2 shacks and just walk in and live on there, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. You need to then seek the authorities to come in and deal with that matter. So I think when you look at evictions, when it's done in an improper manner, when it's done unnecessarily, then I think it's a problem. It's a serious challenge, and it's a serious indictment against the right of that particular human being. Yeah. And but you have to have recourse if someone just invades your property and do as they please on your property.
Okay, John, just a final question for you, and this is in relation to the Ingonyama Trust. Do you know whether the Sen people have any claim to portions of the Ingonyama Trust around the Hlatukulu Forest Reserve? I saw that the City Press had an article where they said Buyisela Ngulwane had written to the Zulu monarch claiming that they have a claim to that piece of land.
The Ingonyama Trust is a different issue, it's a funny issue. Ingonyama was established just before the new dispensation. So it was an agreement between former President F.W. de Klerk and Gacha Buthelezi, and also the Zulu King, Zulekini, may his soul rest in peace. And that was done on the eve of, it's part of the sunset clauses and things. And so the Zulu Kingdom is sitting with approximately more than 1 million hectares of land, and it's not their land. So all the land in South Africa belongs to the San or the Bushmen. So if you ask me a simple, direct question, yes, it's not their land. So yes, we're entitled to some of that land. The person that they are using, I'm not too sure who that person is, and there's an issue around it, but that's an issue that we need to sort out. But okay, in terms of, yes, we have a legitimate claim against all land in South Africa, whether it belongs to the Zulus, the Pedis, the Shangans, the Afrikaners, the English, whoever. We have a legitimate claim against all that land.
Okay, thank you so much, John van Rooyen and JP Sibanyoni, as well as Aaron Struts. Really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered with me, Aldrin Simpier, this evening. Enjoy the rest of your public holiday. See you again next week, same time, same place, right here on the SABC News Channel.